helped to stop Energy East, but it was a combination, an effort of various groups binding together.
Tonight, the Treaty Alliance against tar sands expansion readies itself to back up their West Coast partners.
Indigenous land rights defenders brutally murdered, and historically in Guatemala, these kinds of killings are not solved.
The fight to protect land in Central America reaches the Guatemala Embassy in Ottawa. And a Métis leader tells APTN why the pipeline is good for the Metis Nation. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. A Winnipeg jury has found Kylan Ellis guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Simone Sanderson. The Indigenous woman's body was found in a vacant lot in Winnipeg's North End in September 2012. She was last seen walking in the area a week before her body was found. It took the jury less than 8 hours to reach their verdict. Sanderson's death was considered a cold case until 2014, when police say they received information pointing them to Ellis. He was charged in 2016. A representative for the family spoke outside the courtroom Tuesday evening.
You know, the family is very brave. You know, from what I've seen, they've dealt with this for a long time, and of course it's a very tragic happening and a very emotional moment. So, you know, they're going to go home and kind of recuperate, and then might come out with a statement.
It was a year ago today that the first set of hearings for the National Inquiry to Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls started in Whitehorse, Yukon. Over 50 family members testified at the inquiry. APTN's Shirley McLean visited with one family member who's still dealing with the trauma that was released by testifying.
What I wasn't expecting is to still a year later be in therapy, unpacking all those decades of trauma.
A year later, Tracy Camilleri is still seeking therapy to deal with trauma after testifying at the National Inquiry.
And for 6 years, she was in an unmarked, numbered grave in Vancouver.
Camilleri, along with her mother, Frances Newman, were the first family members to testify at the first set of hearings that started on May 30th, 2017 in Whitehorse.
This Mary Smith that's in the paper might be my sister-in-law.
They spoke of Mary John's niece Smith, Newman's sister-in-law, who was killed by Gilbert Jordan Paul in the early 80s, also known as the Boozing Barber. He killed a dozen of women by forcing them to drink high volumes of alcohol where they would die from alcohol poisoning.
She was being searched for 6 years, and she was already dead.
They also spoke of how the deaths of Mary's son, Charlie Peter Johns, affected the family. He died from a drug overdose on Vancouver's downtown east side in 1994. A year later, looking back, she says she was not prepared to deal with the flood of emotions that came after testifying. Camilleri says the story of Mary Johns and her son Charlie Peter is an example of the intergenerational trauma so many Indigenous families experience.
In therapy, I realized that I had a full trauma bucket from decades of loss, injustices, the stereotypes and racism that you just can't unpack, because the complexity of being an Indigenous woman is, with large families, there's constant loss, there's constant injustice, and consistent racism still.
Camilleri did have a few counseling sessions provided by the inquiry, but she says she's fortunate to continue those therapy sessions that are now being paid for by her employment health benefits.
One of the biggest gifts I got through testifying and the self-care afterwards was, I really lost all that shame I carried as an Indigenous woman and girl throughout my life.
Shirley McLean, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
And we would like to hear what you have to say about this or any other story. Here's how to contact us. Send an email to news@aptn.ca, like our APTN National News Facebook page. Follow us on Twitter @APTN News, or go to our website, aptnnews.ca. Earlier this month, the proposed 60 scoop settlement was approved by a Saskatoon judge. But for the settlement to be certified, the Ontario Superior Court has to give its approval as well. Today, the court was in session again to rule on the settlement. Beverly Andrews brings us the latest.
The approval for the proposed $800 million settlement for 60 scoop survivors is going to take a little longer.
Well, the judge made it clear he has issues and concerns that he wants to have addressed, and those issues also relate to the lawyers in the other class action proceedings which were heard in Saskatoon on May 11th and 12th.
Ontario was the first province to bring the 60 scoops issue to the courts in 2009 with the Brown versus Canada suit. Other actions then followed in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC. It is the lawyer fees for those jurisdictions the judge has issue with, because he feels that most of the legal legwork was done in Ontario, and $12.5 million is too much for firms who came into the process later.
The question that the court is grappling is what to do with what they call the mega fund cases.
The judge has asked counsel involved to provide a written submission of the expenses incurred working on this case. The judge is worried that this ruling may set a precedent for future class action suits, where lawyers will ask for large fees. Many survivors present were torn between wanting to put this case to rest and move on, and the amount survivors may receive compared to lawyers. Survivors will receive up to $50,000.
Overall, I do believe that the judge made the right decision. I think he has in best favor for not just the firms, but of course for us survivors.
Counsel for the law firms involved have 7 days to submit documentation for the court's consideration. A ruling is expected in 3 to 4 weeks. If denied, proceedings on the settlement would have to start over. Beverly Andrews, APTN National News, Toronto.
Time for a quick break, and then we'll bring you much more reaction on the buyout of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Here's a look at Thursday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. A scorcher in Fredericton with a high of 30, 26 under the sun in Halifax. Rain and a high of 20 in LeGrand, 18 under sunny skies in Cartwright. A soggy day in Val-d'Or and a high of 27, 28 with rain in Chibougamau. In southern Ontario, 26 in Windsor, Toronto, and Peterborough, where showers are expected. Rain and 20 in Sudbury and Kapuskasing, 14 in Sioux Lookout. Over to Manitoba, sunny and 2 in Churchill, 15 for Norway House, 21 in Barons River, Winnipeg, and Brandon. Rain across much of Saskatchewan, including Estevan with a high of 22 and Regina with a high of 21. A sunny high of 11 on Thursday for Buffalo Narrows and Uranium City. Welcome back. The news that the federal government was buying the Kinder Morgan pipeline sent shockwaves right across the country. In Vancouver, over 3,000 people gathered to express their discontent over the buyout. APTN's Tina House has the story.
Justin Trudeau promised. He promised a new relationship with my people. He promised that this project could not move forward unless it was done through a vigorous and thorough review, which he broke. He is a liar. He is a liar. He is a liar.
This is what discontent sounds like. Just hours after the news broke that the federal government used $4.5 billion in taxpayers' dollars to buy out a pipeline that they never wanted.
It is time now that the Canadian government put action to the words of the commitments to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and this requires free, prior, and informed consent.
And from Lena Labakan-Musimo, she says the Trudeau government has taken a giant step backwards in the fight against climate change.
There's no way that we're going to be able to meet what we've agreed to in the Paris Agreement with another expansion of a dirty fossil fuel pipeline.
Eugene Kung is with West Coast Environmental Law. He says the pipeline is not a good deal for the country.
In 2007, Kinder Morgan listed the value of the existing Trans Mountain system at $550 million. So to pay $4.5 billion for a part of that, not even all of that, what they had listed it for 550, certainly raises a lot of questions in terms of the federal government's ability to negotiate.
Chris Sims is with the Taxpayers Federation. She says they are originally in favor of the pipeline, but not at the expense of taxpayers.
And depending on how long they take to pay it back, our children and maybe even our grandchildren might actually have to be paying this.
$4.5 billion is just the starting point. There are costs of construction, potential overruns, and so on. Some economists have estimated that the total will be closer to 15 to 20 billion at the end of the day if this gets built.
There are still 14 outstanding court cases to try and stop the pipeline. And back at the rally, Chief Ian Campbell told the crowd they should also continue the fight.
Oil pollution does not discriminate. This is not just a First Nations issue. This is a Canadian issue. It is time to mature as a society. We can do this together.
Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Canada's plan to buy the pipeline, projected for $4.4 billion, has some First Nations upset, and not just those in British Columbia. Coalition of Indigenous groups from outside of BC are hoping to help stop the pipeline. Tom Fenario has their story.
Our government's position is clear. It must be built, and it will be built.
Finance Minister Morneau's Tuesday Trans Mountain Pipeline announcement is still reverberating across Turtle Island, including all the way to Mohawk Territory in the east.
I'll tell you, if we can kick them in the teeth, we're going to kick them in the teeth.
Kanesatake Grand Chief Selge Simon is the eastern face of the Treaty Alliance, a group of 150 Indigenous nations who have agreed to oppose tar sands development. According to the treaty document, the signatory nations will collectively challenge unwanted pipelines that pass through each other's territory.
If, let's say, Stuart Phillips gets arrested and he faces criminal charges because the Canadian government is getting desperate to put this pipeline through, there's going to be an upheaval, I think, within Quebec here with the First Nation chiefs. We're not going to stand for that.
Simon isn't the only one threatening to get more involved. In this May 30th Treaty Alliance press release, AFN Manitoba Regional Chief Kevin Hart says that this was never going to be an easy fight. Indigenous people and our allies have to dig in for the long haul in this battle on many fronts to keep the tar sands in check. Simon says he doesn't intend to wait for more arrests to start happening. He, for one, would like to see the Treaty Alliance and allies impose economic sanctions on Trans Mountain proponents.
And I know I've talked about the possibility of even boycotting products and services coming out of Alberta as a means to say, hey, we're not taking the bullying from any province.
When asked for a timeline as to when an organized boycott or any other action could be expected, Simon declined to be specific. However, he adds that the Treaty Alliance and allies are not to be underestimated.
We helped to stop Energy East, but it was a combination, an effort of various groups binding together. So that unity is going to be very important in any other future actions we try to do.
Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Kanesatake, Mohawk Territory.
Now, leaders from the Metis Nation have been expressing their support for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Manitoba Métis Federation President David Chartrand believes the project is good for jobs and the economy. We spoke to him earlier. President Chartrand, thanks for joining us. Wondering what your thoughts are of the federal government spending $4.5 billion on Kinder Morgan's assets and potentially building the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion.
Well, firstly, I want to commend Minister Morneau and the Prime Minister for keeping their word that this pipeline is essential for all of Canada, and it's a benefit not only to Canadians, but it's definitely a benefit to Indigenous people in Canada. So I think it was very good negotiations on the part of Canada to make sure this pipeline becomes reality and actually commences to a construction immediately. So I'm looking forward to the opportunities that will be coming for Métis people in the Métis Nation of Western Canada, and definitely the opportunity that will come for all Indigenous people as we progress ahead to make sure we get parts of the responsibility. There's lots of pumping stations and all different parts that I think Indigenous people will be looking at to take ownership. And if you look at Morneau's reference, he's also indicating that Indigenous people can invest into the pipeline. And I'm sure there'll be guarantees of our investment if we are to put money in there. And I think the Manitoba Federation will strongly be looking at that.
President Chartrand, as you're aware, a number of prominent Métis people and others have written a letter to Métis leadership, and some have called the Metis Nation, sellouts over this pro-pipeline stance. What would be your message to them?
Well, my message to them is they're entitled to their comments and their opinions. Of course, I seen the letter. There's probably about 50 people listed on there, and I commend them for attempting to pursue their vision of what they see as important. But they have to understand where we're coming from. We've done a very, I would say, holistic review of this whole process. We're looking at it not just from an economic standpoint, we're also looking at it from an environmental standpoint. And I give an example to these individuals that are writing these letters saying they're speaking on behalf of somebody. I know I've been duly elected and acclaimed as a leader of my people to continue to lead my nation forward. And democracy is very important to me. But when you look at the process, like in Enbridge, we have a deal with Enbridge here in Manitoba that'll be coming through our territory and into the United States. We have the President and I meet every two months on a constant ever since we joined partnerships. We have a monitor that will be fully hired, full-time for the next 8 to 10 years and possibly the next 40 years that will be entitled to any spills, any accidents, anything that might occur. Might is the big word. But what's so beautiful about that is that we don't have to wait 6 months or a year to see a report or to tell us what may happen. We have immediate access to the site, and that's a deal we signed with Enbridge. But we also have access to the environmental assurances that they're putting in place to make sure the pipelines are safer than ever. But there's two ways to look at this, and people need to understand that. Do we create more trucking companies to be hauling oil into Vancouver and ultimately to the tankers to go out? More rail lines, more diesel being burnt. There's no getting away from actually affecting the environment in some form or fashion if we want to push the economic engine, or do we just sit back? And environmentalists need to understand this. If we are to tackle the environment that's been damaged in the world, not just in Canada, in the world, it's taken us centuries and decades upon decades of damage. So it's going to take resources to actually rebuild all this. Now, governments don't earn money as a business. They earn it through taxes. In order for it to actually invest back into assisting the environment, they need to earn a tax base. And in order to do that, they need to utilize the economic engines to create that tax base so they can invest back into the environment. The money is just not going to come out of the trees. You actually earn this money through a tax formula, and then in turn they can put back into the environment. So you've got to look at it in two ways. You can't just look at it from one single window approach. You've got to look at it, how does it really affect all of us, from economically, environmentally. But I want to assure these people that are concerned, Indigenous leaders, First Nation chiefs, myself as leaders, as Métis leaders, we have worked very hard to ensure that the industry from now on respects Indigenous rights and ensures that the environment is a very fundamental principle of their operations.
President Chartrand, we're going to have to leave it there, but appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
Well, today was the season finale of In Focus, and we discussed a few different topics that we felt were going to be big issues during the summer months, including Trans Mountain, the National Inquiry, and the upcoming AFN election. Here's a few highlights from the show.
To fix the water situation on First Nations, which we all know is in a terrible state, to fix water would have been less than the purchase, just the first purchase of this pipeline. Now they're saying this pipeline is going to cost $4 billion, but when you factor in all of these different costs, we're talking about $12 billion. You know, between $7 and $12 billion. Think of all of the things that could have fixed in First Nations communities.
The challenge that we are facing in our generation is one of life or death, and there's the quick choice, or there's the long-term choice. And increasingly, in a globalized world, we're being pushed to make the quick choices, but we're not thinking in terms of that 7 generations model that our lodges talk about, that our ceremonies talk about, that our songs talk about.
But I recommended to Minister Bennett that, you shut it down this phase as a phase and come up with a well-thought-out plan phase that can compartmentalize policing, child welfare, some of those other pieces that need to be looked at that are not being looked at.
I think that he's brought a lot of stability to an organization that has just come out of a decade of conservative rule and shrinking budgets, and now the money's flowing again. And that doesn't necessarily mean he's a great leader. It just means that things are a little okay for Chiefs right now, and I'm not sure they're going to want to upset that fruit cart.
And you can find that full episode of In Focus on our website, aptnnews.ca. Land defenders in Central America have increasingly come under attack. According to Amnesty International, in less than a week, 4 people have been killed in communities across Guatemala. That's why a dozen human rights activists and supporters gathered outside the Guatemalan embassy in Ottawa. They're calling on the government of Guatemala to take immediate action to fully investigate the murders. Tara Skur is with Amnesty International.
There have been 9 land defenders murdered since the beginning of the year, and 3 alone this month within a 4-day period, Indigenous land rights defenders, brutally murdered. And historically in Guatemala, these kinds of killings are not solved. There's complete impunity for attacks against land defenders, especially Indigenous land defenders. And we're here to send a message to Guatemala: this cannot continue, this escalation of attacks.
Assembly of First Nations Ontario Regional Chief Isidore Day spent his 50th birthday at the Senate. He was testifying about renewing the relationship between Canada and Indigenous people. He also announced his intention of once again running for Regional Chief. Afterward, he gave his thoughts on the upcoming Ontario election. Polls have the NDP and the Doug Ford-led Progressive Conservatives tied for support. Part of Ford's northern policy is to open up the north to mining, saying he'd drive the bulldozer himself.
Our First Nation people in the north, for example, will not take governments unilaterally walking into their territories and saying, I'm going to drive a bulldozer in and I'm going to open up that mine myself. That's the wrong way to do this, and our First Nation leaders will draw the line when it comes to things like that. But I think it's really important for any government, and in this case, if it is a PC government, Mr. Ford has some rethinking to do.
Time for another quick break, but stick around. There's more to come. Here's a look at the rest of Thursday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. 16 for Peace River and Grand Prairie. 13 in Red Deer and Calgary, where you can expect a rainy day. On the west coast, 14 in Victoria and Campbell River, 18 in Bella Coola, 12 in Sandspit, Prince Rupert, and Dease Lake. In Yukon, 15 in Rock River, Mayo, Whitehorse, and Watson Lake. Over to NWT, sunny and 20 in Wrigley and Norman Wells. 20 as well in Nunavut, 21 in Fort McPherson. In Nunavut, +1 in Arviette, -1 in Whale Cove and Chesterfield. Snow and +2 in Clyde River on Thursday, 0 in Iqaluit. Welcome back, and thanks for sticking around. We're going to leave you tonight with some sights and sounds of the annual planting of the Indigenous gardens outside of APTN World Headquarters in Winnipeg, because that is your APTN National News for this Wednesday. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.